The first thing Dr. Rael Voss noticed about the Keth research station was the smell. Not the antiseptic cold of a sterile lab that he'd expected. Something else. Something that sat at the back of the sinuses like copper and old rain, like the inside of a machine that had been running too long in the dark. He stepped off the transit pod and onto the docking ring, and the smell hit him the same way deep ocean had always hit him when he broke surface, sudden, involuntary, a full-body reckoning. The Keth station, designation Merle 7, hung in the shadow band between two gas giants at the edge of the Velt cluster, and it had the particular chill of a place that received no direct sunlight and had stopped pretending it missed it. He hitched his gear bag higher on his shoulder and looked around. The docking ring was enormous and almost entirely empty. The Keth didn't waste motion, their architecture expressed that. Every surface served a purpose. Conduits ran along the walls in precise patterns that looked almost biological, like the circulatory diagrams they'd handed out in his xenobiology seminars back on Kepler Station. The light was blue-white and came from everywhere and nowhere, sourceless the way deep water was sourceless. No shadows anywhere. The Keth apparently didn't trust shadows. He'd read that in the briefing packet. He'd read everything in the briefing packet, twice. Then a third time on the transit, trying to understand why the United Terran Science Commission had chosen him, specifically, to respond to a Category 1 alien contact request. A formal summons, issued to humanity by the Keth Biochemical Institute, requesting the immediate presence of a qualified human dietary and metabolic researcher. He was, objectively, one of the better xenodietary specialists the UTSC had. That was true. He'd spent 11 years mapping the caloric infrastructure of non-carbon life, had published the landmark paper on Drevali nutrient cycling that the Keth themselves had cited in 4 of their own research releases. That was presumably why they'd asked for him. What the briefing packet had not explained was why the summons had come with a security classification that made his clearance look like a library card. Dr. Voss. The voice came from the far end of the docking ring, and the being who spoke it moved toward him with the smooth, unhurried motion that the Keth used when they were not in a hurry and wanted you to know it. The species was tall and laterally compressed, narrow through the shoulders in a way that made them look like they could slip through doorways sideways, with 2 sets of arms and a cranial structure that swept back like a wave caught mid-break. Their coloring was deep blue-gray, with bioluminescent filaments that ran from the base of the neck down the outer arms and pulsed with a low, steady rhythm. Like a heartbeat if a heartbeat glowed. This one wore the dull copper insignia of the Biochemical Institute over its left thorax. Researcher Anath, it said, stopping at a respectful distance. I am the one who initiated the contact request. I will be your liaison during your time aboard Merle 7. A pause. The bioluminescent filaments shifted from blue-white to a faint gold. Rael recognized from his reading that this indicated something between professional courtesy and genuine relief. I am glad you came. Your request was hard to refuse, Rael said. He kept his voice even. Category 1 summons from a Keth Institute isn't exactly a casual invitation. No, Anath said, it is not. The briefing packet was light on details. Yes. Rael waited. Anath's filaments cycled back to neutral blue-white, which he'd learned meant the Keth equivalent of choosing words carefully. Some details, Anath said, are better conveyed in person, in context. A gesture with one of the lower arms subtle, directing, please, walk with me. The station's research wing was deeper than Rael had expected, built inward rather than outward, away from the hull and whatever minimal light the gas giants reflected. The corridors narrowed as they went, and the smell intensified, not unpleasantly, just more present, more honest. The Keth didn't believe in deodorant or atmospheric masking. They considered it a form of dishonesty, which Rael had always privately respected. They passed through 3 security checkpoints. At each one, Anath pressed a bioluminescent filament to a scanner and waited. At each one, The scanner paused longer than seemed strictly necessary. Popular section, Rail said at the third checkpoint. Sensitive section, Anath replied. Beyond the third gate, the corridor opened into a chamber that was larger than anything Rail had seen yet on the station. A high-ceilinged oval room with walls that were, he realized after a moment, not walls at all but screens. Every surface displayed data. Metabolic charts, molecular compositions, protein maps, caloric density curves. The colors were Keth standard, not optimized for human vision, but he could read enough of it to feel his skin prickle. He stopped walking. The charts were human. Not approximations. Not the generalized Terran biochemistry that appeared in interstellar databases. The sanitized, averaged-out profile that the Keth had been working from for the past 30 years of contact. These were granular, specific. Blood panels and intestinal flora samples and enzymatic profiles and isotope ratios from bone collagen. The kind of data you got from actual physical samples taken from actual human bodies. How long, Rail said carefully, has your institute been running this study? 12 years, Anath said. Rail looked at the screens. 12 years of human dietary and metabolic data, covering. He did a quick scan of the legend panels, a sample population of over 4,000 individuals from 17 different Terran settlements. You could have asked, he said. We did not believe, Anath said, and its filaments went to a color he didn't have a name for yet, something in the deep amber range, that humanity would have cooperated fully, had you known what we were looking for. Rael turned to look at the Keth researcher. And what were you looking for? Anath moved to the center of the chamber, where a single display podium stood. It pressed its lower hand to the surface, and the wall screens shifted, reorganizing, condensing, pulling a single synthesis view forward that overlaid all 12 years of data into one composite picture. We were trying, Anath said quietly, to understand how you survive. The full briefing took 4 hours. Rail sat in the only chair that had been brought into the chamber, a human-proportioned one, which told him they'd prepared for this meeting more carefully than the sparse docking ring had suggested. Anath stood throughout, as the Keth always did in professional settings, moving occasionally to highlight sections of the display wall. 3 other Keth researchers drifted in and out. One named Soval, who was the metabolic lead, one named Kreth, who worked protein synthesis, and one named Davin, who had the distinction of being the one who had proposed the study 12 years ago and who now watched Rail with an intensity that its filaments couldn't quite hide. Davin, Rail sensed, was the one who was afraid. The data told a story that Rail, who spent his professional life thinking about food and bodies and the relationship between them, had never quite assembled in those terms before, because no one in human science had needed to. You don't narrate the water to the fish. Humans, the Keth data showed, were dietary generalists operating at the extreme outer edge of what that term was supposed to mean. They ate everything, not figuratively. The sample population had ingested across the 12-year window proteins from over 200 distinct animal species, fats from dozens more, plant matter spanning 12 different phyla, fungi, fermented materials, raw materials, cooked materials. Materials that other species considered actively toxic, neutralized through cultural processing techniques that had been refined over thousands of years of trial and error. Which was, Anath pointed out in a tone of careful neutrality, another way of saying thousands of years of casualties. We tried to find the edge of your dietary range, Soval said at one point. It pulled up a specific chart, the outlier cases, the extremes, foods that your biochemistry cannot process. There are some, Rail said. Yes, a small number, but the ratio, Soval paused, and he got the sense it was the researcher's version of taking a breath. The ratio of things you can eat to things you cannot eat is inverted from what we observe in any other sapient species. You cannot eat perhaps 3 to 5% of available biomass. Every other known sapient species cannot eat between 60 and 90%. Rael didn't say anything. He was watching the numbers. But that is not the finding, Anath said. The dietary range is significant. It is not by itself alarming. Alarming, Rael said. A pause. Anath's filaments went amber again. The finding, Anath said, is in the protein sourcing. Kreth moved to the front of the room. This was its domain, protein synthesis, amino acid profiles. It pulled up a chart that Rael recognized immediately as an isotopic analysis. Carbon-13 ratios, nitrogen-15 concentrations. The specific chemical signatures that in a body's tissue told you where the protein in that tissue had come from. What the creature had eaten to build itself. Across the sample population of 4,000 humans, from every settlement, every dietary tradition, every cultural and economic background, the nitrogen-15 concentrations were extremely high. Rael sat very still. You know what that means, Davin said from the back of the room. It was the first time the older researcher had spoken directly to him, and its voice had a quality that Rael filed away carefully. Not hostility exactly. Something more complicated. Fear trying to sound like science. Yes, Rael said. High nitrogen-15 concentrations in body tissue indicated trophic level. The higher your position in a food chain, the more your diet consisted of animals that had themselves eaten animals, the higher your nitrogen-15 signature. Apex predators ran the highest concentrations in any given ecosystem. Animals that ate mostly plants ran the lowest. Humans ran concentrations that, on any other planet, in any ecosystem that the Keth had studied across 60 worlds and 3 centuries of xenobiology, would have classified them without ambiguity. Top of the chain, end of the chain. Apex predators. You eat other apex predators, Anath said. Not only herbivores, not only small prey. You have a documented consumption record that includes your own terms bears, large felids, cetaceans, other primates, and historically before interstellar expansion each other. That last one was a long time ago, Rael said. Yes, Anath said, but the biochemistry does not forget. Rael leaned back in his chair. The screen surrounded him, 12 years of his species' eating habits laid out in precise alien notation, and he thought about the first time he'd sat down with a Keth research brief and marveled at how different from humans they were. Photosynthetic supplements, mineral pastes, controlled fermentation of plant-based proteins, never anything with a nervous system, never anything that could feel pain, never anything that had once, in some earlier evolutionary chapter, been capable of making a decision. The Keth were herbivores. Not just culturally, structurally. Their digestive systems had no mechanism for processing animal protein efficiently. Their immune systems flagged it as a threat. The very concept of eating something that had once been a predator was, in Keth neuroscience, processed by the same brain region that handled mortal danger. They weren't studying human diets because they were curious. They were studying human diets because they were scared. How many of your species have seen this data? Rael asked. Anath's filaments held it amber for a long moment. More, it said, than I would prefer. The name of the problem arrived, with the second briefing the following morning. The second briefing was different. Anath was there, and so were Soval, Kreth, and Davin, but there were also 3 new Keth in the room, wearing not the copper insignia of the Institute but the deep gray-black of the Keth Interstellar Authority. Bureaucrats, policy. The kind of Keth who showed up when a scientific finding had started generating political consequences. Their names were Vel, Orath, and Tessiv. Vel and Orath did most of the talking. Tessiv sat in the back and watched Rael with an expression its filaments tried to neutralize and couldn't quite. The problem was this. The Institute's 12-year study had concluded 8 months ago. The synthesis report had been submitted to the Keth Scientific Council 6 months ago. 3 months ago, a member of the council, Anath's careful phrasing, not naming who, had forwarded a summary of the findings to the Interstellar Authority's Committee on Species Risk Assessment. The Committee on Species Risk Assessment was, in the Keth governmental structure, the body that evaluated threats. Invasive species, resource competitors, potential pathogens. Its formal mandate was ecological and epidemiological. Its informal mandate, accumulated over 400 years of operation, was broader. A subcommittee had been convened. Rail did not know its formal name. He got the sense, from Anath's filaments doing a slow, involuntary cycle through every color in the amber to red range, that the subcommittee had a name that Anath did not want to say in front of him. The subcommittee's preliminary conclusion, Vel said, in the smooth, uninflected voice of someone who has said this sentence many times to test how it sounds, is that the human species poses a Category 3 ecological risk to settled space. Category 3, Rail said. A species with the demonstrated capacity and behavioral record to disrupt the dietary ecology of any environment it enters, through unrestricted predation. Rail was quiet for a moment. The screens around them were showing different data now, not the metabolic profiles from last night but historical records, archaeological, extinction records from Earth, the megafaunal collapse of the late Pleistocene human expansion across the Pacific, the die-offs that had followed every major human diaspora. The numbers were real. He knew them. Every xenoecologist knew them. Humanity had, in the span of its pre-technological history, driven to extinction somewhere between 300 and 500 large animal species. It had done so not through active malice, but through the simple, relentless machinery of what it was, a predator that could eat anything and was smart enough to do it efficiently. Category 3, he said again, means what in practical terms? Monitoring, Vel said, enhanced interaction protocols, trade restriction review. Tessive from the back, quarantine proposal pending full committee review. The room went slightly colder, and Anath's filaments dimmed. Quarantine, Rail said. Pending review, Vel said quickly. Pending review, right. Rail looked at the extinction charts on the walls. He thought about 30 years of Keth-human diplomatic contact, about the treaty frameworks and the trade relationships and the cultural exchange programs. He thought about the 40,000 humans currently living in Keth-administered space, and the Keth researchers on their own exchange programs in Terran settlements. He thought about what happened when the second most powerful interstellar civilizational bloc decided that humanity was a Category 3 ecological risk. I want to see the full subcommittee report, he said. That document is classified at a level, Orith began. I want to see it, Rail said. I'm assuming that's why you brought me here, not because you wanted to show me the metabolic data. You wanted someone who could look at your report and tell you whether you've made a scientific error or whether your science is right and you have to figure out what to do about it. He looked at Anath. Yes. Anath's filaments pulsed briefly to gold. Yes, it said. Then show me the report. They showed him the report. He read it over 2 days. In a small room they gave him off the research wing, with a cot and a food synthesizer and no windows because there was nothing outside the windows but the dark between 2 gas giants. He read it with the focused attention he developed over 20 years of working with species whose reference frames were not his own, which meant he read it as an attempt by a genuinely intelligent civilization to understand something that frightened them, and tried to have compassion for the parts where the fear made the intelligence stumble. The science was good, he had to concede that. The methodology was sound, the sample size was substantial, and the nitrogen-15 analysis was, if anything, conservative. They'd used parameters that would have underestimated the signal rather than amplified it. The conclusion that humans were dietary apex predators was not wrong. The extrapolation from that conclusion was where the fear started doing the work. The subcommittee had modeled human ecological impact on 7 theoretical worlds, Keth-colonized or Keth-aligned systems, where human populations might expand over the next 2 centuries. In every model, using the historical precedents from Earth and from the smaller-scale colonial records from early Terran expansion, human dietary behavior produced measurable negative cascades in the local food webs, not extinction-level events. Cascades, destabilizations, the kind of gradual disruption that an ecosystem could absorb if it was resilient, but that the Keth, who had spent centuries building carefully managed biospheres in their settled systems, had no interest in absorbing. The quarantine proposal was the conservative option. The subcommittee had also modeled a second scenario. He found that one on page 47 of the supplemental materials, buried in a technical appendix under the neutral heading, Alternative Mitigation Pathways. He read it twice. Then he sat with it for a while, looking at the food synthesizer in the corner of his room, which was providing him with a perfectly adequate if culinarily uninspiring set of nutrients in forms he could eat without any thought at all. The alternative mitigation pathway was not quarantine. He went and found Anath. "You need to tell me," he said, "who in the authority knows about the pathway in Appendix C." They were in a small side corridor off the research wing, because Rael had not wanted to have this conversation in a room with screens and other people in it. Anath stood with the particular stillness that he'd learned to read as the Keth version of controlled distress, the filaments held at absolute neutral, which was itself the tell. "Several," Anath said. "Several is a number that could mean 3 or could mean 300. It is closer," Anath said carefully, "to the former. But it's not just the subcommittee." "No." Rael looked at the corridor wall. Someone had run a conduit along it at knee height, and he found himself staring at it, at the engineering logic of it, the decision to put the power line there instead of overhead, because overhead you could walk into it in an emergency, and the Keth thought 3 steps ahead about emergencies. They were a careful species. They had built carefully for 400 years. They had made a carefully managed universe, and now they had found something in it that ate carelessly, that had always eaten carelessly, that had built its entire biological success story on the willingness to eat anything that could be eaten. "Anath," he said, "what is your position on the pathway?" A long silence. The filament stayed neutral. "I wrote the contact request," Anath said finally. "Category 1. Maximum urgency. I wrote it because I believed that if the right human scientists saw this data and saw the report, there was a possibility of a different conversation than the one the subcommittee is having." A pause. "I do not believe in Appendix C." "Good," Rael said. "But I need you to help me prove why it is unnecessary, not simply to argue against it, or to call it wrong, or to appeal to the diplomatic history between our species." Anath's filaments shifted, the faintest edge of gold. "I need science. I need a counterargument that holds in the same frame as the argument it is countering." Rael nodded slowly. "All right," he said, "let me ask you something. In your 12 years of dietary data, did you track behavioral correlates?" "Explain." "The metabolic data tells you what humans eat. Did you also look at what humans choose not to eat? The selection patterns, the social constraints, the deliberate restriction of dietary behavior?" Anath was quiet for a moment. Then, "You are referring to food culture." "I'm referring to the fact," Rael said, "that your study found apex predator biochemistry and stopped there. You found the hardware. You didn't look at the software." He requisitioned the full behavioral dataset from Soville and Kreth, who gave it to him with the wariness of researchers, who aren't sure whether the person asking for their data is going to make their work look better or worse. Then he worked. He slept 4 hours a night for the next 6 days, which was less than he preferred but more than he'd managed during the final months of the Drevali project. The food synthesizer provided. He developed a complex relationship with the machine, not affection exactly, but the particular intimacy of someone who is depending on something unglamorous to keep them functional. He ate without tasting and thought without stopping. On the morning of the 7th day, he called Anath. "I need a Keth cultural historian," he said. "Senior, someone who works on dietary tradition specifically." "I know one," Anath said. "She will be resistant." "To me or to the question?" "Both. Her name is Eth. She has been one of the voices on the subcommittee arguing most strongly for the conservative option." A pause. "She is not wrong in what she believes. She is simply afraid." "Afraid," Anath agreed. "Set up the meeting." Eth was not what Rael had expected, which was his failure for having expectations. She was old. He'd learned to read Keth age in the deepening of the bioluminescent filaments, the color getting richer and more complex with time, and Eth's filaments were the deep, layered blue of very old ocean glass. She moved carefully, with the unhurried dignity of a species that didn't rush its elders, and she looked at Rael the way he imagined a very intelligent animal might look at another very intelligent animal it wasn't sure about yet. "I know what you're going to argue," she said, before he could say anything. "I'd be surprised if you didn't," he said. "You're the one who built the methodology for evaluating dietary restriction practices in the Felvari case. Your paper is still the standard reference." Eth's filaments held neutral, flattery. "Citation," he said. "I use your work. I'm going to use it again. I'm going to ask you to look at 12 years of human behavioral data and tell me whether you see what I see." "And what do you see?" He set his work up on the portable display he'd been given. The full overlay, the metabolic profiles that showed apex predator biochemistry, and layered over them, the behavioral data that Soval and Kreth had collected but not, until now, fully integrated with the chemical analysis. The dietary restrictions. Not allergies, not the involuntary biochemical refusals that appeared in any species. The deliberate, culturally enforced, socially reinforced choices not to eat specific things. The taboos and the traditions and the moral frameworks. The 4,000 human subjects in the study, distributed across 17 settlements, and the extraordinary cross-cultural consistency of the patterns. Almost no humans in the sample, regardless of cultural background, ate other primates. Almost none ate dogs or cats, the animals most integrated into long-term human domestic life. Almost none ate species that had been culturally coded, in their tradition, as persons, as beings capable of relationship or communication, or some form of recognized inner life. The apex predator was real. The study was right. The nitrogen-15 concentrations were genuine. But the apex predator was also a species that had, somewhere in its deep history, developed a nervous system complex enough to look at something it could eat and decide, on moral grounds not to. And then built social structures to enforce that decision. And then, over thousands of years, expanded the category of beings it was willing not to eat. "You're arguing," Eth said slowly, "for intentionality." "I'm arguing for a mechanism," Rael said. "Your subcommittee found the predatory potential. What they didn't model was the regulatory capacity, the degree to which human dietary behavior is not simply predatory impulse, but predatory impulse under active management by cultural and ethical systems. Those systems have failed historically." "Yes," he said, "they have, and your species has had conflicts and betrayals and treaty violations. The existence of failure doesn't disprove the existence of the system." Eth was quiet for a while. Her filaments did complex things he didn't have names for. "There is a problem," she said finally. "Yes," he said. "The subcommittee will not find this sufficient. Science, yes. The counterargument is scientifically sound, but the argument in Appendix C is not purely scientific. She looked at him directly, and her filaments went to a color he was beginning to understand as the Keth equivalent of honesty that costs something. It is political. It is fear. And fear does not respond to evidence in the way that ignorance does. Fear has already decided. Rael sat with that for a moment. Then I need to talk to the subcommittee directly, he said. They will not agree to that, Eth said. A human scientist arguing against human quarantine in front of the body considering human quarantine. The conflict of interest is obvious, he said. I know, I'm not going to argue against quarantine. I'm going to ask them to explain something to me. They agreed to the meeting eventually, because Enath pulled every formal mechanism available and because Eth, quietly, without informing Rael she was doing it, added her name to the request. The subcommittee met in a chamber deep in the authority section of the station, further inward than the research wing, further from the hull in the section where the ambient smell was strongest and the light was dimmer and everything felt ancient and serious. 7 Keth, the gray-black insignia, Vel and Orath, who Rael had already met, 5 others he hadn't. And Tessiv, still in the back, filaments still working to hold neutral and not quite managing it. Rael stood in the center of the room, no chair this time. He'd asked them not to bring one, he wanted to stand. I've read the full report, he said, including the supplemental materials, all of them. A brief stir through the filaments of the assembled Keth. Tessiv's went briefly to red and back. I'm not going to argue that the science is wrong, Rael said, because it isn't mostly. Humans are dietary apex predators. The nitrogen-15 data is real. The historical extinction record is real. The ecological modeling is reasonable given its parameters. He paused. I'm going to ask you a question about a different species. He pulled up a chart on the portable display. Not human data. Keth data, specifically. The dietary history of the Keth from the pre-industrial period, 2,000 years before current, during the Keth expansion era when they had first moved beyond their homeworld. The early Keth colonial record shows that in approximately 12% of colonial sites, pioneer populations experienced acute nutritional stress within the first decade, he said. The standard response was emergency protein supplementation using local animal biomass, small scale, carefully recorded, discontinued once the agricultural infrastructure was established. The room was very quiet. That's in your own archives, Rael said. It's in the standard historical record. Early Keth colonists under nutritional emergency conditions ate other animals, including, in at least 3 documented cases, animals that later colonial surveys described as showing signs of tool use. That was Vel started. 2,000 years ago, Rael said. I know. It was a long time ago. The Keth scientific consensus at the time did not recognize tool use as a sufficient criterion for moral status. The decision was made in conditions of genuine crisis by people who used the ethical framework they had, which was imperfect, and which later generations of Keth scientists refined significantly. He let that sit. Does the existence of those historical incidents tell us what the Keth are? Does it tell us that the Keth are, fundamentally, a species that eats tool users? Or does it tell us that the Keth are a species capable of making mistakes and then building better frameworks to avoid them? The room stayed quiet for a long time. You are saying, said one of the 5 Keth he hadn't met older, filaments like Eth's deep and layered, that you are the same. I'm saying that the study your institute ran found something real and then interpreted it incompletely, Rael said. The apex predator is real, but so is everything that humans have built on top of it. The ethical systems, the dietary traditions, the moral arguments, the constant, genuinely constant, internal argument humanity has been having with itself for 10,000 years about what is and is not acceptable to eat, and why, and what the rights of other beings are and how far those rights extend. He looked around the room at each of the gray-black insignia, each set of controlled filaments. You are afraid of the predator. I understand that, but the predator has a conscience. That's actually the more interesting finding. That's the finding that tells you what humans are. Tessive from the back. A predator with a conscience is still a predator. Yes, Rail said. And a species that once ate tool users and now has 400 years of principled non-predation is still a species that once ate tool users. He held Tessive's gaze as steadily as he could. The question isn't what we were, or even what we biologically are. The question is what we do with it. And on that question, you need science and history and diplomacy, and probably a much longer conversation than this one. But what you don't need is Appendix C. He reached into his gear bag and put a data chip on the floor in front of him. He didn't have a table to put it on, so the floor it was, the gesture slightly absurd and somehow right for it. That's my full counter-analysis, he said. It references your data, it references ETH's methodology from the Felvari case, and it models human dietary behavioral management across the full 12-year sample using the same risk assessment parameters your subcommittee used for the ecological impact projections. The numbers don't eliminate the concern. I'm not pretending they do, but they change the category. He stepped back. I came here because someone in this station thought science was worth trying before fear made the decision. I'd like to believe she was right. He looked at Anath, who was standing just inside the chamber door, filaments cycling between gold and something deeper that Rail didn't have a name for yet, and thought perhaps he'd need more time aboard the station to learn. Then he stopped looking at anyone and just waited. The subcommittee deliberated for 11 days. Rail spent most of it in the small room with the food synthesizer and the cot, working, not on anything related to the case, just on the backlog of his regular research that had accumulated during the transit and the first week on the station. He ate what the synthesizer provided without complaint. It occurred to him, on the 5th day, that the machine had gradually been adjusting its output over the course of his stay, refining the nutrient profile based on whatever monitoring it was doing, making small calibrations that he hadn't noticed because they were too subtle for conscious awareness. Just doing its job, learning what he needed. On the 7th day, Anath came to his room. Not with news, just to sit, or the Keth equivalent of sitting, which was standing very still in a way that indicated you were not standing for any productive purpose. You were not supposed to know about Appendix C, Anath said. I know. When I requested the full report for you, I did not anticipate that they would include the supplemental materials without review. Lucky for me, Rail said. Or for me, Anath said, its filaments went gold briefly, then back. What you said in the chamber, the Keth colonial records, the tool user incidents, a pause. How did you know to use that? I've read 400 years of Keth scientific literature, Rail said. It's in there in the pre-industrial colonial reports. Not hidden, just old. He looked at the food synthesizer. History is usually the counterargument to fear. Fear is almost always about a fixed image of something, what a thing is, permanently and essentially. History shows that things change. Change within constraints, yes. The constraints are real, but the change is also real. Anath stood still for a while. I have not been certain, it said finally, that bringing you here was correct, that putting a human in front of the subcommittee would help rather than confirm the fear. Did it help? I do not know yet, a long pause, but I believe your argument was heard. Whether it was sufficient, Anath's filaments moved through several colors slowly. We are a careful species, Dr. Voss. Caution is structurally built into how we make decisions. This is not always a strength. No, Rail agreed. Sometimes the careful option is also the wrong one. He said it without accusation, and Anath heard it that way. On the 11th day, Vel came to his room. The quarantine proposal was tabled. That was the news. Not rejected, tabled, pending further study, which in the Keth governmental framework was as close to a rejection as the system was capable of producing quickly. The expanded interaction protocols were still on the table, still being drafted, and would probably take another 2 years to finalize. The dietary study would be extended and reopened, this time as a formal collaborative project between the Keth Biochemical Institute and the United Terran Science Commission, which meant they'd have to ask the UTSC, which meant humanity would finally know it was being studied. Rael thought the UTSC would find that interesting. He thought they might even agree. Appendix C, he said to Vel. The alternative mitigation pathway has been removed from the active document, Vel said. Precise phrasing. Removed from the active document, not from the record. The Keth did not pretend things hadn't happened. All right, Rael said. The subcommittee voted 6-1, Vel said. Rael did not ask who the one was. He had a sense it was Tessiv, and he thought that was probably fine. One voice of unresolved fear in a 7-person body was not dangerous. It was, if you were doing this right, necessary. He packed his bag. The room had not accumulated much. He traveled light, always had, a habit from the field years on Drevali when everything you carried on your body, and extra weight was a slow tax on every day. He checked the food synthesizer as he was leaving and saw, on its small operational display, the nutrient log from his 11 days in the room. Calories in, composition, calibration adjustments. A precise record of what he'd eaten, what he'd needed. The Keth built things that paid attention. He'd always respected that. He found Enath in the corridor outside. I want to come back, Rael said, formally, as part of the collaborative study. I want to be the Terran lead. Enath's filaments went gold, immediate and full before it could exercise any professional moderation. That, it said, would be agreeable. I want to bring 3 of my graduate students, Rael said. 2 in metabolic analysis, 1 in dietary cultural history. Your Kreth, your Soval, and your Eth if she's willing. She will be willing, Enath said. I believe she will say she is doing it to check the work, but she will be willing. And I want access to the full 12-year data set, no restrictions. That will require. I know it will require a process, Rael said. We'll do the process. He looked at Enath. I want to understand what your study actually found, not just the part that was scary, the whole thing. Because I think if we look at the whole 12 years, we're going to find something interesting. What do you expect to find? He thought about it. About the nitrogen-15 data and the extinction records and the food synthesizer's quiet calibration work and the conversation with Eth about mechanisms, and about the early Keth colonial records with their uncomfortable footnotes, and about a species that had been afraid of what another species was, and had built a 12-year study around that fear, and had then, slowly, carefully, been willing to hear a counter-argument. I expect to find, he said, 2 species trying to figure out what being careful actually requires, as opposed to what being careful looks like. Enath's filaments pulsed gold to something deeper, richer, a color he was only now beginning to see. Perhaps, it said, that is a study worth doing. He was in the transit pod, outbound, when his comm unit received a message from an address he didn't recognize, internal to the station, sent in the last few minutes before the docking ring had closed behind him. He opened it. It was from Tessiv. No greeting, no explanation, just a single sentence in careful, formal Terran standard, the kind that said the author had drafted it several times before sending. Your data on the dietary restriction patterns was the most compelling element. The mechanism argument. I wish you had led with that. Rael read it twice. Then he sent back one line. Next time I will. He put the comm unit away. The transit pod moved through the dark between the gas giants, through the lightless zone where the station lived its careful life, and he watched it go until it was just another shadow, and then he looked forward, toward the relay point where he'd pick up the signal to home, and thought about nitrogen and conscience and the long, complicated, ongoing project of a species trying to earn its own biology. He was hungry. The pod had a synthesizer too, small, efficient, doing its quiet work. He asked it for something warm and ate it in the dark without tasting it, and thought about what he was going to say to the UTSC when he got back. And outside the viewport, the stars held their position with the patient indifference of things that had watched a great many species figure themselves out. He finished eating. He thought, looking forward to the work. 3 months later, Rail was back. The transit from the UTSC processing hub to the Velt cluster relay took 11 days, and he spent most of it going over the collaborative framework documents that had been drafted in the interim. 140 pages of careful language negotiated between Keth Institute representatives and UTSC legal, each sentence carrying the particular weight of two civilizations deciding exactly how much to trust each other. He'd read it with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen treaty frameworks come apart at the seams, looking for the places where the vagueness was load-bearing, and the places where the precision hid something no one wanted to say plainly. The framework was mostly good, not perfect. The section on data sovereignty had 3 different interpretive readings, depending on which paragraph you used as your anchor, and the clause governing sample collection for the extended study was going to cause a practical problem in about 6 months when someone tried to implement it in the field. He'd noted both issues in the margin and added them to a list he was maintaining of things to raise in the first working meeting. His 3 graduate students were on the same transit. He'd chosen them for complementary reasons. Deja Mwangi was his metabolic specialist, 28 years old, originally from the Kenyan orbital platform, with the kind of focused intelligence that expressed itself in very long silences followed by very precise sentences. She'd read the Keth Nitrogen 15 study on the way out, and had not said anything about it for 2 days, which he'd learned meant she was working through its implications rigorously, and would have a question when she was done that he probably wouldn't be able to answer immediately. Petra Holm was his second metabolic analyst, older, 35, from the Scandinavian deep station settlements, built with the particular physical and psychological density of someone who had grown up somewhere cold and pressurized, and had never fully unadapted to it. She read fast and talked fast and had already, by the 3rd day of transit, produced a 14-page critique of the subcommittee's ecological modeling that was, in Rail's assessment, about 80% correct and 40% too aggressive in its framing to show to Keth researchers directly. Marco Os was his dietary cultural historian, which was the discipline that lived at the uncomfortable intersection of food science, anthropology, moral philosophy, and social history, and which attracted, in Rail's experience, people who were comfortable with uncomfortable intersections. Marco was 31, from the West African settlements, and had spent his doctoral work on the history of human dietary taboos, the mechanisms by which cultures built and enforced and gradually expanded their lists of protected species. He was the student Rail had chosen most deliberately for this particular project, and Marco knew it, which produced a thoughtful wariness in him that Rail respected. They'd had one working session on the transit, day 7, at the small table in the shared research module. "Walk me through what we're actually doing," Petra had said. Not challenging, just Petra's operational style, which required explicit framework before she could begin. "The Keth ran a 12-year covert study," Rail said. "They found apex predator biochemistry. They got scared. A subcommittee proposed something nobody wants to talk about. I went out and made a science argument and it bought us time. Now we're going back to run the proper study, the one that looks at the whole picture, not just the alarming half." "How cooperative will the Keth researchers be?" Deja asked. First question right on schedule. "Anath, genuinely. Soval and Kreth, professionally. They'll do the work, they'll share the data, they won't volunteer anything. Eth," he paused. Eth is the one to win over. She has the most to teach us and the most reasons to hold back. And the authority people? Marco asked. We don't interact with the authority people directly, Rael said. The framework keeps them at one remove. But they'll be reading everything we produce. And Tessiv, the one who voted against the tabled proposal, will be watching the work for any signal that her position was wrong to hold. So we're doing science, Marco said, and we're also doing diplomacy by other means. We're doing science, Rael said. The diplomacy is just a consequence of doing it well. Marco had nodded slowly. And if the science shows something that makes the situation worse, then we'll have learned something true, Rael said, and we'll deal with it. Merle 7 looked exactly the same from the outside. The dark between the gas giants, the smell that hit you when you stepped off the transit pod, the sourceless blue-white light of a civilization that didn't trust shadows. But this time there was a second Keth waiting at the docking ring alongside Anath Eth, standing with the careful stillness of someone who had made a decision that cost something and was committing to it anyway. Her filaments were deep and layered and held at neutral, but when she saw Rael she did something with the lower set of arms that Anath had taught him, on the calm sessions in the intervening months, meant acknowledgement. Not warmth, not yet. Acknowledgement. Dr. Voss, she said. Researcher Eth, he said, thank you for being here. I am here because the work requires it, she said, and because, a pause, her filaments held, because I want to know whether you were right. So do I, Rael said honestly. A small shift in her filaments, just a pulse, too quick to read confidently, but something. He introduced his students. Deja and Eth looked at each other with the mutual wariness of two people who are both very good at precision and are immediately aware of it. Petra shook the 3 sets of Keth hands, or the Keth equivalent, which involved a specific brief contact of the lower arms, with the direct energy of someone who had been raised to believe that being unfamiliar with something was not a reason to be tentative about it. Marco said almost nothing, looking around the docking ring with the particular attention of someone cataloging environmental details for later reference. They were shown to the research wing. The chambers had been reconfigured. The large synthesis room from Rael's first visit now had both human and Keth workstations set up, 2 long tables facing each other with the display wall visible from both sides. The setup had a provisional quality, the furniture of a collaboration that hadn't decided yet how comfortable it was going to be. The first working meeting started the following morning. The work itself was the kind that doesn't narrate well, slow, methodical, iterative, the kind of science that produces its results through the accumulation of small clarifications over weeks and months, rather than through a single revelatory moment. Rael had always preferred it this way. The revelatory moments were real, but they were built from the unremarkable labor of checking your assumptions, and checking them again, and then checking the assumptions behind those assumptions, and the researchers who understood that were the ones he wanted to work with. Deja and Soval spent the first 3 weeks going back through the nitrogen-15 dataset together, recalibrating the parameters with Deja's critique of the original methodology, not to disprove the finding but to establish its precise shape. How high were the concentrations exactly? What was the distribution across the sample? What did the outliers look like, and what explained them? The answer, when they had it, refined the original result without contradicting it. Human nitrogen-15 concentrations were consistent with high trophic positioning in any ecosystem humans occupied, but the within-sample variance was higher than the original study had noted. There was a spread, a range, and the lower end of the range corresponded, with a statistical significance that Deja marked as high, with populations whose cultural dietary restrictions were most deeply embedded and most consistently maintained. It was a small finding, 1 data point, but it was a beginning. Petra and Kreth worked the protein sourcing data, the same molecular profiles Rael had reviewed on his first visit, now pulled apart more carefully, layer by layer. Petra had a habit of working at hours that didn't correspond to any shift rotation, which Kreth found confusing and then, over the first 2 weeks, quietly adapted to, appearing at the workstation whenever Petra did without anyone formally discussing this. By week 3, they were running analyses in parallel without speaking, which was its own kind of communication. What they found was more complex than the original study had captured. Human protein sourcing was indeed broad, the predatory range was real, but the sourcing patterns were not random. They were structured. The broadest sourcing occurred in populations under stress, resource scarcity, colonial pioneer conditions, disrupted supply chains. Under stable conditions, human populations narrowed their sourcing substantially, and the narrowing followed consistent patterns that corresponded, with remarkable cross-cultural regularity, to the same categories of protected animals that Marco was mapping in the cultural history data. Marco and Eth worked slowly and carefully, which was to say they argued constantly in the precise, formal, entirely professional way of two researchers who disagree about everything and are both too rigorous to pretend otherwise. Eth had built her methodology on the assumption that dietary traditions were primarily economic in origin, that cultures protected what was economically valuable to protect and were indifferent to the rest. Marco's position was that the moral and relational arguments preceded the economic ones in most documented cases, which Eth contested on the grounds that the historical record was incomplete and the assignment of primacy was interpretively motivated. They were both partially right, which meant they had to talk to each other for long enough to figure out which parts. This took 6 weeks. What they found at the end of that process was a synthesis that neither of them had started with. The mechanism was not purely economic or purely moral, but relational. Humans extended dietary protection to animals they had sustained relationships with at the individual or collective level. The longer and more complex the relationship, the more robust the protection. And the category of animals that humans sustained complex relationships with had expanded, over the documented historical period, in a direction that was consistent and directional. Outward. More species, greater complexity of recognized personhood, more robust protection. Not smoothly, not without setbacks, not without the kind of catastrophic exceptions that Tessiv's vote represented in miniature, but the direction was there. Eth sat with this finding for a day before she said anything about it. When she did, it was to Rael privately in the corridor outside the research wing. "The direction," she said, "is more significant than I expected." "Yes," Rael said. "It suggests a mechanism that is," she paused. Her filaments went through several colors, self-correcting, within limits. Under the right conditions. That's one interpretation. What is another? That the direction is real but the limits are the variable that matters, Rael said. The question of what disrupts the self-correction, stress, scarcity, ideological pressure, is the question your subcommittee should be asking, not whether humans are predators, whether the conditions for managed predation can be maintained. Eth's filaments pulsed gold briefly. "That," she said, "is a different kind of risk assessment." "Yes," Rael said, "it is." The full synthesis report took 4 months to produce. Rael wrote the human sections, Enath wrote the framing and the summary. Eth reviewed every page and returned her comments in dense, exacting notation that was, over the course of the document, gradually and consistently moving in the direction of endorsement. Deja added 3 appendices that were, technically, outside the scope of the agreed framework but which Soval had cosigned, which made them impossible to exclude without an argument nobody wanted to have. The report was submitted to the Keth Scientific Council on a Thursday, the day being a concession to human scheduling preferences, a small thing, noted in the submission record and, Rael suspected, read with careful attention by someone in the authority. He was on Merle 7 when the submission went through. standing in the large synthesis room, which after 4 months had stopped looking provisional and started looking like a place where work happened, the furniture worn into familiarity, the two tables no longer facing each other quite as formally. Anath stood beside him. "It will take the council time to review," Anath said. "I know," Rael said. "The subcommittee will be waiting for the council's reading before it reconvenes." "I know. There is no guarantee." "I know," Rael said more gently. "We did the science. That's what we could do." He looked at the display wall where the synthesis report's summary page was still up, the conclusions laid out in the clean, precise language that good science used when it was trying not to overstate itself. "The rest is their process." Anath's filaments went gold and held there. "The rest," it said, "is trust." "That too," Rael said. He thought about a transit pod moving through the dark between two gas giants, and a food synthesizer doing its quiet calibrating work, and a one-line message from Tessiv that had started as fear and arrived as something more complicated. He thought about what nitrogen-15 concentrations meant, and what they didn't mean, and about the long argument humanity had been having with itself since before it had words for having it. The argument about what could be eaten and what couldn't, about where the line was, about who got to be on which side of it and why. He thought about how the argument was still ongoing, how it would probably always be ongoing, how the ongoing nature of it was not the evidence of failure that Tessiv's vote represented, but the evidence of a species that hadn't stopped asking the question. Outside the viewport, the gas giants turned in their slow, patient orbits, indifferent to everything smaller than a moon. The dark between them was absolute and cold and full of signals passing in every direction. Keth transmissions, Terran relays, the background noise of civilizations talking to each other about what kind of universe they were going to share. Rael watched it for a while. Then he turned back to his workstation, because there was still a great deal of science left to do, and he was, in the end, someone who preferred working to waiting. He pulled up the next file and got back to it. The council's response came 5 weeks later. It arrived not as a formal communiqué, but as a message from Anath, 3 sentences, sent to Rael's comm unit at an hour that suggested Anath had been awake to receive the council notification, and had immediately forwarded it without waiting for a more reasonable time. The quarantine proposal had been formally withdrawn. The collaborative study had been accepted as the foundational document for a new joint working group on interspecies dietary ecological risk, a working group that would include, by the Council's explicit request, both Keth and human researchers. The alternative mitigation pathway in Appendix C had been reclassified as a historical research artifact, and archived under a level of restriction that meant it would not be available for policy consultation for the next century. Rael read the message twice. He was sitting on his cot in the small room that had become, over 4 months, something almost comfortable. He looked at the food synthesizer and thought about all the things the Keth scientists on the station had watched him eat over the course of this visit. The metabolic monitoring had continued throughout, now openly, with his consent, because that was the kind of study they were running. He'd eaten the synthesizer's careful provisions every day and thought almost nothing of it. That was the thing the Keth hadn't quite captured in 12 years of data, not the act of eating, the indifference to the act, the way a human could consume nutrients without ceremony and then get up and do the thing they actually cared about, because eating was not the point. Eating was just the cost of continuing, and what you were continuing for was the thing that mattered. He sent a reply to Anath, 4 words. "Good, when do we start?" Then he got up and went to find the others. He found them in the synthesis room, all 3 of them, plus Soval and Kreth, and standing at the edge of the room with characteristic careful stillness, Eth. Someone had sent the message to the whole team, apparently, or the information had moved through the station's channels by whatever mechanisms Keth institutions had for the movement of significant news. Nobody said anything for a moment. The room had the particular quality of a shared breath held. Then Petra said in her flat, direct way, "Right, so the working group. I want the protein sourcing portfolio." And the room, cautiously and then less cautiously, came back to life. Deja and Soval started talking about the extended dataset parameters. Marco and Eth resumed, apparently from the middle of an argument they'd been having earlier, which had something to do with the historiography of Keth early colonial dietary practices, and whether Eth's own published work had fully accounted for a particular class of economic exception. Anath moved to the display wall and began pulling up the working group charter documents, its filaments cycling through the warm gold that Rael now read as clearly as any word in any language. Rael stood in the doorway and watched this happen, human and Keth researchers in a room together, arguing about science, which was the best argument there was because it had a referee. Because when you argued about science, you couldn't simply insist. You had to show your work. You had to put your data next to the other person's data and let both datasets speak. And sometimes what they said was not what you'd expected, and that was the whole point. He thought about the first time he'd stood in this room, 12 years of human data on the walls around him, and the smell of the station in his nose, and the particular cold of a place that received no direct sunlight, and the feeling of being studied and found alarming, and the question of whether the alarming thing was actually what it appeared to be. He thought about nitrogen-15 concentrations, and what they meant about where protein had come from, and the long chain of consumption that built every body in the known universe. He thought about trophic levels and food webs, and the particular position humans occupied in the ones they entered, and about what they did with that position, and about the fact that what they did with it was not fixed, not permanent, not beyond the reach of the conscience that had developed alongside the predatory hardware, and that was, in its own way, just as biological, just as real, just as earned through the long, brutal process of being a species that had survived. The conscience was not a cage. It was not a restraint bolted onto something that would otherwise be a monster. It was part of the same creature, the predator and the conscience together, the whole package, the actual thing, as natural as the nitrogen-15 in the bone collagen, and as old as the fire that had first made the proteins more digestible and the social structures that had first decided which other beings were too known, too close, too real to eat. He thought about Tessiv's message, the most compelling element, the mechanism argument. He thought he understood now what Tessiv had meant. The subcommittee had seen the predator, and they had been afraid of what predators were, their essential nature, fixed and dangerous. What Tessiv had taken away from the chamber, what had shifted the single most frightened vote on the subcommittee to an abstention rather than a sustained opposition, was the argument that the mechanism existed, that there was a thing in human biology and culture and history that actively worked against the unconstrained predatory impulse, not always successfully, not without ongoing effort, but structurally present, deeply embedded, getting stronger over the documented historical period rather than weaker. A predator that built its own constraints. That was, he supposed, either the most reassuring thing about humanity or the most interesting thing about it, and he was professionally inclined to treat interesting and reassuring as compatible categories. Anath looked up from the display wall and caught his eye. Its filaments were gold. "Are you ready?" it asked. Rael looked around the room one more time, at the two tables that had stopped facing each other quite so formally, at the 6 researchers who were all, right now, arguing about something specific and technical and verifiable, at the walls that still showed the original 12-year dataset in its Keth notation, alongside the new integrated analysis that was already significantly more complicated and significantly more true. "Yes," he said, and walked into the room. Outside, between the patient gas giants, in the dark that received no direct light and had stopped pretending it missed it, a great many signals continued passing in every direction. carrying the ongoing noise of civilizations trying to understand each other well enough to share the universe they occupied, trying, in their various ways, to earn the position they held. It was hard work. It was slow work. It was work that never quite finished because the questions at the center of it were not the kind that stayed answered. But it was the work, and Rael was, as he had been most of his professional life, exactly where the work was. He pulled up a chair and got started.